Morning. Good morning, everyone. And it's good to see you all here today, especially those who don't usually join us on Saturdays. So today we have the special privilege of having a guest speaker, Paripurna, Paripurna Richard Ollier, who is a member of the Amida Buddhist order in the UK. He has spoken to our group before, and we're really happy to have him back today. Paripurna Ollier is a retired history teacher who, in retirement, has been studying the application of Zen Buddhism and Pure Land Buddhism to modern life. And today we'll be talking about his fondness of Gary Snyder's poetry and how that informs Zen and Pure Land Buddhism. I'll mention that Paripurna has also been involved in a drama theater group for people with learning disabilities in his retirement, and leads meditation with that group as well. So without picking up more time, I'll turn things over to him so he can tell us more about Gary Snyder's poetry and what it means to him. If you'll give me just a moment to move my pins around. And there we are. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much, Will, and warm greetings to everybody. And thank you for having me back and giving me the opportunity to talk about one of my poetic and spiritual heroes, Gary Snyder, who was born, as many of you know, in 1930 and is still going, which is a remarkable achievement in its own right, I think. And I've been a lifelong enthusiast for Gary Snyder and his poetry, almost lifelong anyway. I first became interested in him at the age of 16, and I'm 73 now, so do the maths, as they say. So, and why? Why have I was contemplating this question when I was starting thinking about this talk. And I think the reason why I'm so interested in him is because of the contrast between his existence and mine. I'm a kind of had a happy but fairly humdrum life as a suburban teacher in England, as Will said, whereas Gary Snyder has done just so much with his life. He's now we know him mainly, I suppose, as a poet. He's been known since about 1955 when he read with Allen Ginsberg at the Sixth Gallery in San Francisco and launched the so-called San Francisco Renaissance, which was largely concerned with beat poetry and was very, very countercultural. And I guess over the years, in some ways, he's moved much more mainstream as his environmental interests, particular, have struck a chord with people these days. But just to list a few, just to start up and list a few of the things which he's interested in. or has been interested in over his lifetime. Native American anthropology, Buddhism, obviously, particularly Zen, but also Pure Land and Tibetan environmentalism, I've mentioned already, Oriental languages, geology, classical Chinese and Japanese literature, walking and mountain climbing, travel. He lived for many years in Kyoto in Japan and underwent Zen training, but also he'd been to India, Nepal, Hawaii, Canada. He was a merchant sailor at one point, always working his passage between different countries. Very interested in forestry. He's been an English teacher, a university lecturer, an arts administrator in California, and a builder, a very practical kind of guy. In 1974, he built the Ring of Bone Zendo, which was a Mahayana Buddhist Sangha and stroke tribe, and still is, I guess. So his life contrasts very strongly with my own. And much of my Buddhist and imaginative life, I suppose, I've lived vicariously through him. He's given me access to a wider spiritual universe. He's taught me how to become meditatively involved with things, absorbed in things. I'll talk about this later, but his poems are almost sutras for me. He's straddled the gap between the academic and the practical. There's a kind of melodrama about a lot of his verse, a wide sweep. He takes in the whole of universal existence, if you like, but also has the facility to concentrate on the minutest detail of everyday life. He make the capacity to make the ordinary things in our life seem extraordinary, which I think often happens in meditation as well. I don't know if you would agree with me on that, but quite often when one is sitting, things which you kind of seem to be very ordinary suddenly take on a much more significant aspect, I think. And also, I've really admired his notion that poetry is there to be performed. He spent all his life performing his poetry, and I like that about him. I think poetry should leap out of the page, really. So that's the difference between Gary Snyder and me, and that's why I admire him so much. Today's talk, I've tried to make it kind of general but accessible. I'm aware that some of you guys may know a lot more about him than I do. I'm also aware that some people may not have come across him before. So I've tried to inspire people either to look up or re-look up stuff that I mention, or read and reread him. Out of all the things I could have concentrated on, because of this audience and my own interest, really, I've concentrated on trying to look at what we might call the Zen and the Pure Land aspects of his poetry. Now, these are the Zen aspect and the Pure Land aspect are visible, in my opinion, in different ways. Sometimes they're visible in the content, but not so much in the content, more in the kind of attitude they have towards reality, if I can put it like that. But if we start off with the content, his verse is absolutely peppered with references and allusions to Zen and Pure Land. The poems teem with talk of concepts like the bodhisattvas, vows, emptiness, compassion, temples, and not just the Pure Land temples where he dwelt in Kyoto, but also Pure Land temple. There's one called Cheon-in, which I've actually had the privilege to visit, which was Honan, the great pure Kamakura era Pure Land teacher. It was his home temple, Cheon-in, in Kyoto. And Gary Snyder writes a poem about that, in which he sits on the steps which have been polished by the feet of generations of pilgrims and eats a plum. And I'm particularly fond of that poem, which incidentally appears, if you forget the title of some of these, they are on the list that I sent out with to Will and Carol. So you can look some of these up, and please do. Another thing he's interested in, which he keeps coming back to, is Buddha nature. That kind of elusive Mahayana concept, which people debate and talk about a lot of the time. And he has a kind of humorous take on Buddha nature because he lives so close to nature. And he says that there's one poem in Myths and Texts which he says, beasts all got Buddha nature, all but coyote. He says the coyote is so kind of beyond the pale that the poor old coyote does not have Buddha nature, which is, but that's typical of the way he kind of, these concepts and ideas are part of his kind of spiritual subconscious, if you like, and they kind of emerge in little contexts, little snatches of poetry like that. There's another one about Tara, the predominantly, I suppose, Tibetan bodhisattva. There's a poem called An Offering for Tara in Mountains and Rivers Without End. So what about more specifically Zen stuff? Well, you guys are more expert on Zen than me. So forgive me if I might get this wrong, and you can bring it up in the discussion. But the thing about the real Zen aspect which strikes me about his verse is his sense of immediacy and a concentration on his imminent experience of the here and now, his stress on awareness. And he kind of strips reality of any sentimentality, but consequently, he kind of elevates the emotional content, if that makes sense. And to describe what I mean by that, I want to look at, or to read a little bit, a couple of extracts from a poem called Go Now, which he wrote after his wife, Carol. He's been married several times, but his wife, Carol, died in 2006 from cancer. And in the poem Go Now, he dwells unflinchingly, I suppose, in minute detail on her dead body. And it strikes me that there's a really kind of Zen level of intense observation that goes on here. I'll just read you a little bit. It's about how the eyes sink back and the teeth stand out after a few warm days. This observation is placed within a Buddhist context. She's so thin that the joints showed through, each sinew and knob. Shakyamuni, coming down from the mountain after all that fasting, looked plumper than her. Well, in the poem, he and his son Kai witness the cremation of Carol's body. As they watch the temperature gauge on the furnace, they, and I quote from the poem, burned incense and chanted the texts for impermanence and all beings who have lived or whoever will yet. Things writ only in magic and only for the dead. So for Gary Snyder, one of the things that I think is a kind of Zen quality is the preciousness of life because of its transience, because of its precariousness. In the poems, nature constantly presents Gary Snyder with life or death challenges and then takes us to the limit. Sometimes this is almost humorous. You'll be aware, I'm just kind of reminding you, this is a bit of background, it's a common sense thing, but I'm in a lit room now and I can't see anything outside except blackness because it's dark here. But if I went close to the window, I would perhaps notice a bit more of what's going on. So in this poem, Bear, Snyder says that someone clicked on his flashlight and there, out the window, 6 inches away, were the eyes of the bear. So he suddenly comes literally face to face with nature, with this kind of dangerous proximity of nature, with only a thin pane of glass between him and it. And attentiveness for him is not a luxury. It's a kind of be mindful or die situation, or be mindful and die anyway. Snyder's sister, Thea, was killed after being struck by a car in California in 2002. And this must have has come just as a sort of bolt out of heaven. It was almost a freak accident. As I understand it, she'd stopped on the freeway to help somebody who had had an accident and was herself killed by a passing vehicle. And in the same year, his friend, the poet and fellow Zen practitioner Philip Whalen died. There's a kind of Pure Land link there as well, because with Philip Whalen, he'd attended earlier in life a course on Pure Land Buddhism, Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, at Berkeley, California, with the Buddhist churches. So he knows all about impermanence in his poetic bones. But I think this is worth stressing as well, emphasizing as well, that his Zen is very active. He can't just sit on the cushion, you know. He does just sit for long periods, and he's trained in meditative traditions, but he's always, particularly with his environmentalism, he's always wanting to get off the cushion and act as well. And there's a marvel, possibly my favorite all-time Snyder poem is at White River Roadhouse in the Yukon, where he literally leaves his mat to serve the world. The mat's very important as a basis, but he hears a call and he goes to answer it. And I love that poem so much because of that. In terms of Pure Land content, it's always more implied than actually spelt out in the poems. I mean, in his life, in his Buddhist life, he's mixed with Pure Land practitioners. In 1978, for example, he joined the Buddhist Peace Fellowship with Al Bloom, and those of us of a Pure Land disposition will know Al Bloom very well, a big publicist for Shinran and that branch of Pure Land thought. And in 1993, Snyder laments in a letter the fact, as he sees it, that often Asian American Buddhists are not seen as fully American Buddhists in the sense that white Buddhists are. And he quotes as evidence for that. He says, you know, that many of the Pure Land practitioners in America are of Japanese or Chinese descent, and this isn't fully recognized as a bona fide, as it were, authentic group of American Buddhists. So he's always been on the kind of fringes of Pure Land thought and interested himself in Pure Land Buddhism. Sometimes he mentions places in Japan which have resonance for both Zen and Pure Land. For example, Mount Hiei in Tokyo was where, historically, the headquarters of the Tendai sect of Japanese Buddhism. And many people, such as Honan in our Pure Land tradition and Dogen in your Zen tradition, started off on Mount Hiei. But in his poem called Mount Hiei, you would never know that. There's no reference to it at all. It's just almost, it seems like an arbitrary title to his poem. There's just one poem that I've noticed which has an overtly Pure Land theme, I suppose, in that it deals with Canon stroke Kuan Yin, which is called the Canon of Asakusa, which he writes at length about a temple dedicated to Canon stroke Kuan Yin Bodhisattva. And the poem turns into a pilgrim's prayer and invocation. He says, please guide us through samsara. So it's a kind of prayer. At one point in his writings, he makes rather an interesting kind of merging or synthesis of Zen and Pure Land. He's describing in a letter to Allen Ginsberg in 1957 how he writes of a woman who, and I quote, says one time she sold one of her Zen cones and the trees were covered with jewels and everywhere she looked was giant lotuses and special music, just like Amida's Western paradise. So in this extract, a kind of a Zen practice leads to a Pure Land experience, if you like. So much for content. But I argue that it's in their stance towards the world that the poems relate most significantly towards Zen and Pure Land. And that stance is they offer us a way of living inside them, a way not so much of understanding the poems as partaking in them. Uh, so the question is, what do they reveal about ourselves as we reenact the thought processes behind them? And I want to talk, first of all, about the poems as, can we think of the poems sometimes as Zen meditations, or I suppose not just Zen, but Buddhist meditations in general? Well, Gary Snyder wrote, I think it was in the 1980s, but it might have been a bit later than this, the introduction to an anthology of Buddhist poetry in America called Beneath a Single Moon. And in that introduction, he wrote, meditation is not just a rest or retreat from the turmoil of the stream or the impurity of the world. It is a way of being the stream. Meditation may take one out of the world, but it also puts one totally into it. Poems are a bit like this too. And I think it's a really significant sentence. Poems are a bit like this too. They put one into the world. For example, in the rather mundanely titled, I suppose, Things to Do Around Kyoto, from Mountains and Rivers Without End, there's no I in the poems at all. They're just a kind of list of experiences which the reader can re-experience as they read or kind of take possession of. So just to quote a few lines of this, this is a kind of, these are the things that one can do in Kyoto, according to Gary Snyder. Lie on a mat and sweat in summer, shiver in winter, pluck weeds out of the moss, plant morning glories, walk down back alleys, listening to looms, watching the flocks of sparrows whirling over trees on winter sunsets. Or in another poem, Yays from the Backcountry selection. Like so many other poems, they focus on the doings of ordinary people without comment. And I quote again, old Mrs. Kawabata cuts down the tall spike weeds, more in 2 hours than I can get done in a day. And I think that such a focus on small details gives ordinary people a real presence, a real dignity, which is kind of restored to them through the verse. The other way I think we can helpfully think of these poems, as well as we can think of them as being exercises in meditation or enactments of meditation, they're also, I would argue in a way, they're in their own way kind of little sutras, little teachings. There's one really, really significant poem from a Pure Land point of view, which I want to talk about briefly now. And I need to give you a little bit of, for those of you that don't know, a little bit of background about a basic Pure Land Buddhist concept. In the larger Pure Land Sutra, there is the kind of trainee Amida Buddha, if you like, makes a series of promises. And for us, one of the significant ones of these promises is, if anyone calls my name, in other words, Amida's name, and doesn't get reborn in the Pure Land, I, Amida, will not accept enlightenment. So it's a kind of vow to save all beings who call Amida's name. And this is the foundation of Pure Land practice. Now, in a poem in Myths and Texts called Amitabha's Vow, Snyder has Amitabha saying, if, after obtaining Buddhahood, anyone in my land gets tossed in jail on a vagrancy rap, may I not attain the highest perfect enlightenment. And there are several verses like this. And on the first reading, I thought, this is a kind of blasphemy in a sense. It is taking a Pure Land Sutra and kind of applying it directly to a modern situation. But then I thought about it. I thought, no, what he's doing is he's narrowing the gap between um, a kind of Buddhist spirituality and everyday life. He's showing that, you know, if anybody homeless is ill treated, I will not accept enlightenment. And I find that on reflection to be very moving. He's bringing the Pure Land and the ordinary world much closer. And I would argue that the poems themselves are a kind of Pure Land which appears in which apparent contradictions are reconciled. And there's a poem that I think beautifully illustrates this with a rather long title, which is taken from the Chinese, called "One Should Not Talk to a Skilled Hunter About What is Forbidden by the Buddha." And this is another of those poems in which Snyder forensically concentrates on describing in minute detail a kind of aspect of the natural world. In this case, it's a dead grey fox with a dead squirrel inside its stomach. And so it's almost like one of those Russian dolls with one corpse inside another one, because the fox has obviously eaten the squirrel, and something in turn has killed the fox. So the implication is that all beings have to survive by a kind of hunting, by a kind of predatory existence of one sort or another. But the Buddha forbids this and says, you know, that one should not kill. So it's the same dilemma that we all face. You know, how do we square the circle in this? But in a kind of way, Buddhist compassion and the violence of the natural world become reconciled in the poem itself. When you read it, you get a strange but rather wonderful sense of the reconciliation of incompatibles, if that makes sense. But I think in itself, if it doesn't make sense, I think it's worth kind of sitting with this kind of problem, this kind of cone, if you like. So there's a kind of little Pure Land almost when one reads that poet. Okay, so to conclude, and I'm aware that I've kind of packed quite a bit into this, but also missed a lot out. So do feel free in the following discussion to pick up on any omissions or controversies or whatever you like. But to conclude, I personally continue to keep Gary Snyder's work beside me and inside me as a meditation, and as a kind of enactment of the Pure Land, or he gives me little moments of the Pure Land, and I value him greatly because of that. So I think what I'm trying to say as well is that in reading Gary Snyder's poems, one is not so much reading about Zen Buddhism or about Pure Land Buddhism. It's rather that the reading is itself a meditative experience and a kind of preview of the Pure Land and what it might be like, where contradictions are overcome and we view things from a higher and hopefully more enlightened plane. But I love his work, and I if you haven't come across it before, even if you have, I do commend it to your attention, and I thank you for listening today. I very much value that as well. Thank you.